Hi, everyone. This is Josh with the Dram Good Drink. Today I'm here with David Vitale, founder of Starward Whisky, which recently won an incredible 12 double gold medals at the 2022 San Francisco World Spirits Competition. Uh, David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today, and congratulations on the big wins.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to be on the show. It's one of those things where, obviously as a distiller, you don't wake up every morning, to make awards. You wake up to make great whiskey. But certainly they don't go unnoticed, and huge kind of it's very humbling to get so many in one go.
That's really impressive. I mean, it certainly says a lot about the quality of the spirits you're putting out. Uh, But before we get to talking about the whiskeys more specifically, which I'm very eager to do, can you tell me a little about yourself, how you got into whiskey, and then what led you to starting your own company?
Yeah, my whiskey journey actually starts in beer. I was in tech in Australia, and kind of had burnt out of that, and sold the business that I'd started, and was really keen to kind of think about something that I could tangibly kind of hold and feel and touch and sort of share with people, more at a sort of human level as opposed to a sort of virtual level. And I was equally a really huge fan of craft beer, and made way more homebrew than I could ever drink myself. So that was kind of the starting point of the idea of, like, I'm gonna make a beer. That was kind of the idea. But equally, I think my inspiration for Starwood was kind of born of this idea that, Australian winemakers have really proven on a global scale that they could take it up to the French, particularly, just like American winemakers did. And, I felt like, well, what if we could take this beer globally? But, you very quickly figure out that good beer doesn't travel well. And that's right. That's the reason why we've got an abundance of amazing, microbreweries, craft breweries, scattered around both Australia and the United States, is because, it needs to be fresh and local. So with that in mind, I kind of shelved the brewery idea, but fell upon whiskey by accident, and then um, realized that a few things. Well, whiskey is kind of made from a fermented grain mash. It's basically a beer that's distilled and then aged. So that was kind of the starting point. And the second was that, particularly in Australia, there's a really strong anchor in single malt Scotch. And there were a whole heap of single malt whiskies that I'd never heard of before. Like, growing up, for me, Chivas Regal was the gift we gave, our accountant for Christmas every year. That was all I knew about whiskey. Wine was, so much more of our culture, coming from an Italian background. So, we I had no idea about, like, this whole artisanal whiskey making scene called single malt Scotch that had been, making whiskey for 150, 200 years. And so for me, they were like the craft beer of the whiskey world. And so I got fascinated by that, and that got me hooked. And I convinced a local distillery to give me a job so that I could learn how to make whiskey. And then at some point realized that this was something that we could do, that we could actually create something that was really different to Scotch and bourbon and Irish whiskey, to be on the sharing cabinet at home alongside all of those great bourbons and whiskies that came from Australia, and talked the place it was made just as much as they do.
Very cool. It certainly seems like you've definitely succeeded at that, certainly on the world stage now.
Well,
Uh,
yeah. Look, we got it's great to be in the States. I actually moved here 3 years ago. Perfect timing, So
just
it's been quite the adventure. But I think for me, success is not necessarily the awards and things like that. As I said, that they're great recognition for the quality whiskey we're making. The success for me is like getting to the point at one day at which people have heard of Starwood, and that, they're pretty excited by sharing it with their friends, and what it means to them. That's exciting.
That's very cool. And one of my favorite things about whiskey, it really resonates with what you're saying, is that personal connection of, I can pour a dram and sit and hang out with my friends and we can all talk about it. And, it's kind of something that can bring people together, which is something I find really appealing about it. So you started your own company and it's been going well, but I'm curious, what are some of the things that surprised you when you were starting your own whiskey business?
Oh, geez. How long have you got? um, Look, I think, you always think it's going to take half the time and, just as much as you budgeted, to make a bottle of whiskey that you can sell. And, clearly it takes a lot longer and, a lot more money to kind of do these sorts of things. Because, particularly with whiskey, and one of the things that I'm really excited to see, particularly in the United States, there's a lot of distilleries that make whiskey are kind of focused on whiskey and nothing else. And in Australia, when I started, I'm just trying to think, I don't think there were any that were just whiskey producers, maybe one out of 20 or 30 that had started at that point in time that were just focused on whiskey. And the reason for that is that you've got to, keep the lights switched on. And if you aren't seeking external investment, it's a long road to hoe to kind of save enough money to lay enough whiskey down to keep moving forward. And so we took that path of just kind of focusing on one thing, which is a whiskey. And it's a lot harder than I thought it would be, because the reality is that, we budgeted to make the whiskey and not have any income. But the reality is to set up and start selling whiskey. This is pre-internet sort of sales and things like that being really popular. Costs you even more than making the whiskey itself. So that was a big surprise. I kind of felt like if I just got to market, everything would be easier. But it turns out that it's, as expensive to sell a bottle of whiskey as it is to make it. And that was something that, from a cash point of view, just kind of surprised me, I guess, very, very early on. That's I guess the entrepreneurial side of things. But from a customer perspective, and certainly in the United States over the last 4 years, I feel like we've timed our run into the US at a perfect time where people are really curious about whiskey and curious about drinks, actually. I think growing up, you used to be a beer drinker or a wine drinker. Oh, I only drink rum, or I drink vodka or whiskey or gin. Now it's like, no, all of those things are relevant to me. I just need to kind of find the right occasion for them to be a part of my life. And I think that the exciting thing is that also those occasions are starting to blur, right? Whereas it used to be, barbecues were the purview of maybe white wine and beer. Why not have a whiskey and a highball? Why not kind of think about lighter red wines or whatever it happens to be? So I think that that's exciting. And, given where we've come from in terms of the previous 11 years of building a brand in Australia, we didn't start our launch with that mindset. So it was a surprise to kind of get to the US and see how open-minded people are about Australian whiskey or whiskey from other places. And also the fact that, yeah, well, whiskey doesn't have to be neat by a campfire, or with a tweed jacket and a, pipe in a leather Chesterfield. Whiskey can be anything you want it to be.
Awesome. I really like that. The idea that it's making it something approachable and for all occasions and available to everyone is, I think, when I got into whiskey, I know that there was this mindset of, why are you in your 20s, drinking this old man drink?
Yeah.
And it's really over the last few years I've noticed that sort of shift in mindset, and I don't know if it's as whiskeys become more available and a wider variety of whiskeys has hit the market, it's sort of shifted that, or if the mindset shifted is then sort of encouraged more products to become available in our market, or which way that sort of goes.
Look, I think there's a couple of things going on. Look, there's crazy people like me making really good as good whiskey as has ever been made, right? Like, and it's not to suggest that it's any better than some of the legacy brands that exist, because my cabinet's full of them. I love whiskey spelt both ways, right, from around the world. But I think that there's something interesting, just like I said, well, whiskey was what we gave our accountant for Christmas. Like, I think there's a lot of people that kind of feel like the older whiskeys are for their dad. Let's face it, it's kind of highly kind of gendered towards males historically. But these modern whiskeys and modern drinks are kind of not, and so, there's a huge opportunity for modern whiskeys to turn up and speak on the terms of the drinker, in their language, and not have to kind of carry perversely the burden of tradition, which is so much of what sort of set those whiskeys apart in the past, was time-honored traditions and all those sorts of things, which I'm a romantic, like I love that. But equally I can see why, for a modern generation of whiskey drinkers, they're looking for more than just that historical story.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm like you. I certainly, the stories resonate with me. I love the history. I love reading about, a brand's been doing this same process for 200 plus years. They're using the same stills for X number. It's really cool. But it's just as cool to me when there's, this new guy on the scene is doing something completely out of left field that's never been done, whether that's using different grains or aging in different kinds of casks, or blending unique products with different types of whiskeys that we haven't seen blended together. I think all that is super cool.
It's exciting and really interesting, and I think a stronger, it creates a stronger connection to place. Like, I live in Seattle, and our local distillery here is, a few of them. I mean, by law in Seattle, 50% of the barley must come from the state of Washington.
Really?
And so all of a sudden, it's like, well, what could we do that's interesting? Well, up in the Skagit Valley, they actually grow barley as a byproduct of tulips. Like they kind of grow tulips in the, that's their revenue earner, and barley kind of regenerates the soil and till it in and all that. And so they were kind of, well, maybe we could take that. You know what I mean? Like, it's really inventive stuff. And, from our perspective, it's like, well, we've got, I was kind of inspired by those winemakers, but we've got thousands of wineries within a day's drive of the distillery. What if we could age the whiskey in those barrels? And so it's sort of, as you're pointing out, it's like challenging the perception of what whiskey has been, and thinking about what it can be in the future. Neither of them better, just a different take.
I think that's very cool, and certainly as whiskey is gaining in popularity and commanding more shelf space at stores, there's certainly, I think, room for both the old guard and the kind of new adventurous whiskeys out there side by side on the shelf.
Josh, I mean, if there's 60 feet in the aisle, 55 of it's bourbon, from Kentucky and Tennessee, right? Like, and then, I'm fighting for the last 5 feet where Scotch, Irish whiskey is, and, Japanese whiskey, if you can find it, is, so like we're still like, nothing's, it's the axis of the world is still in place. It's still like, very bourbon centric.
The old guard is still in charge there. That's true. I think in my head, it's a lot more egalitarian than it probably is in the real world.
I'm okay with that.
Mega Mart, and there's an equal variety of everything I could possibly want. And while we're at it, it's all, in stock and readily available.
Yeah.
That'd be awfully nice.
That would be nice. See all this white hair? It's kind of called supply chain logistics getting into the States,
Yeah. Not to linger too long on the business side of things, as I do want to talk more about your whiskey specifically, but something I'm really curious about is a little more about those logistics of, as an Australian brand, what sort of goes into, breaking into the US market, and not necessarily, the paperwork and all that, but how do you go about getting people to be aware of your products and, standing out on a whole nother continent?
Well, I think, so we've exported into other markets in the past, Japan, the UK, France, Germany. And I think the thing that, people, I think as in living, having lived in America, I think people kind of get it. But certainly from a selling booze perspective, you might not understand, because you buy your booze locally, is that every market is effectively like its own country. It shares the same sort of legal tender, and there are some federal laws in terms of how alcohol needs to be labeled and all that sort of stuff from a compliance perspective. But if I'm kind of at the border of Washington to Portland, to Oregon, it might as well be as different as France to Germany. You know what I mean? In terms of how we turn up, who we talk to, how it gets sold, and more further afield, I think culturally there's differences in terms of the way whiskey is consumed and has been in the past, and people's biases and perceptions. And funnily enough, Texas and Florida are really big markets for Starward, because particularly in Texas, there's a huge local single malt whiskey scene and craft distilling scene, making great bourbon, great single malts, great corn-based whiskeys, rye, you name it down there. So we turn up, and you'd think it would be quite the opposite of like, get out of town, but it's not. It's like, oh no, like we long ago let go of Tennessee and Kentucky whiskey, and are really interested in the new, so that was a big surprise. California is the 8th largest economy in the world, and boy, it feels like that too when you think about how big the market is in terms of turning up into different segments of there, whether it's chains or independent retailers and restaurants and bars. So, I think the key thing that we've taken, like the big watch out for aspiring distillers from overseas thinking about the United States is, it's actually 48 states, right? In the, the continental United States that you're dealing with, and, treat them like you would each of those states like a country,
Yeah, that's again, as a consumer, not something that crosses my mind much. As I go into a different state and I'm like, oh, cool, what products do they get here that I can't get back home? And that's fun. But from the other side of things, I don't think about, oh, why are certain things available here and not elsewhere? Some of the
Yeah,
hurdles you
it's
might have to jump through.
it's it's quite a challenge, like, I mean, it's one of those things, like I said, it's probably, if someone's exporting to the United States, it's like saying I'm exporting to the EU, right? Okay, well,
It puts it in context, definitely.
you know what I mean? It's like, okay, well, that's kind of the general context of where the geography, but it has nothing to do with like the route to market and engaging with customers that each state has, does differently. And I guess that's probably a great metaphor for lots of things in America, right? Like, it is very different from state to state.
It's very true. So let's, speaking of things that are different, why don't we talk a little more about what makes Starward unique as a whiskey brand?
So I think the first thing is we're new, right? Like we're a modern distillery made, and we're making whiskey in Australia. And as much as Australia is important, and we couldn't make whiskey the way we do anywhere else in the world, I think that the thing that Australia's offered Starward is this license to make whiskey in a really unrestricted way. So you know you're probably familiar with, Kentucky or bourbon legislation's quite dense. Like you want to have a lawyer have a look at what you're doing compared to what the law says to make sure it still can be called a bourbon or a straight whiskey or bottled in bond, and all of the different nomenclatures and complexities that come with that. A whiskey by law in Australia is quite the opposite. You can shoot a cannon through the legislation. It's so broad, like it's basically a fermented grain mash that's distilled and aged in wood for a minimum of 2 years. That's it. So, I mean, that, doesn't have to say anything about, even oak, it's just wood, right? There's an age gate, which I think is really helpful in terms of just making sure you weed out anybody that wants to kind of, kill someone. But putting that to one side, you are really free to do whatever you want as long as it's a grain that's been fermented, distilled, and aged. And that's a lot of fun for me, and it gave me license to really shamelessly steal from every territory: Scotch whiskey, American whiskey, bourbon, rye, different brands, the way that they approach things, to then craft something that is uniquely Australian, but also still has its roots in what makes whiskey great in all of those other places, such that, as I said earlier, when it's on the sharing cabinet, it's like, oh, I see what he's done here. And it's funny because if you're a Scotch whiskey drinker, you see it through a Scotch whiskey lens. But if you're an American whiskey drinker and a bourbon drinker, you see it through an American whiskey lens, and all of the things, and then, I think that there's a lot of kindred spirits in the new world of whiskey that kind of see what we've done too from a modern perspective that they do as well. So it's kind of been fun to come at whiskey with a really with the permission to have a clean sheet of paper, and then craft something that's really approachable, accessible, and I think delicious, and of course well crafted. Like that's always important. But I remember one of my mentors saying that, like, David, you need legs to beat Usain Bolt, but that's not why you'll win. And I think it's the same with quality, right? Like, of course you need a quality product to be on the shelves, but that's not the reason why people are going to get excited by it.
Very cool. Very true. One of the big new releases that you've got out is the octave barrels. And I know that's the first of your project range of whiskeys to be available in the United States. So I know I'm very eager to try that. Can you talk a little more about what that range of bottlings is all about?
Yeah. So let's kind of, and before we get there, because it'll kind of thread through, you'll see in a sec. The big thing that I guess that I was very mindful of in terms of making that approachable, accessible, really delicious whiskey that's well crafted was, like, it's got to stand in that sharing cabinet alongside all of those other approachable, accessible, well crafted and delicious whiskeys, be it a bourbon like Baker's Mark or Wild Turkey, or a Scotch whiskey, a single malt like Balvenie, or a blend like Johnny Walker Black, or a peated whiskey from Islay, Japanese whiskeys. Like, it's got to have its own place on that shelf. And so I wanted it to be a really distinctive representation of the place we made. And that's why we age all of our whiskeys from the day they're made in Australian wine barrels. Mostly big Aussie reds like Shiraz, Cabernet, and Pinot, which is a lot of fun. Like, instantly, if we're talking about American whiskeys and bourbons in particular, they have to be in brand new charred oak barrels. So there's a real distinction in flavor profile coming from using ex-red wine barrels as opposed to charred oak. And we could go down that rabbit hole later on if you want to, in terms of why.
I'd love to talk about that later.
Yeah, but so red wine kind of is our signature sort of profile barrel at Starward. And so let's face it, if you kind of want something that's consistent and sort of delivers on the promise every time for the drinker at the end, that can get a little boring for the distiller and the winemakers that are blending the whiskeys at the other end, right? And so one of the things that I felt really compelled to do, and given the relationship we have with winemakers, brewers, and distillers, within the local community, was to then sort of like say, well, let's have a play. Like, we've got permission to with the regulations. So let's take, with our projects, unexamined ideas in whiskey for a walk, right? So some of the more existential ones were like, does whiskey need color to taste good, right? So we had a white whiskey that was aged 3 years, right? And I can tell you, Josh, how we did it, but then I'd have to shoot you afterwards.
Reporting from it.
Yeah. There's that sort of stuff, but then some fun things like whiskey finished in a ginger beer cask. We just launched in Australia our 7th edition of that, and that's coming out later this year in the United States as well. And it's like, I mean, if you love ginger, and who doesn't, it's just like an explosion of flavor and heat coming from the ginger, not the whiskey. And it's just like a bit of a, sensorial, like, you know, trip, you know,
Very
you know,
cool.
in all of the ways, right? So it's a lot of fun. And then, you know, more recently, our projects have been a little bit more down the line of examining our bond store with different parcels of whiskey that we've aged. And so, you know, again, we'll just go a little bit deeper into red wine, barrel aged whiskey. You know, winemakers use French oak and American oak. They don't just use American oak. These barrels, when we get them, because we're so close to winemaking regions within a day of that winemaking region, are still saturated and wet with wine. Inside the oak of the barrel, like there's about a gallon of red wine. So that can only impart amazing flavor into the whiskey itself. A winemaker in the Barossa Valley that's making a big Aussie Shiraz might have a different wood policy to a winemaker that's making a big Aussie Shiraz in the Grampians north of Victoria. You know, that might be different to the Hunter Valley. So, you know, each winery is going to have their fingerprint style and house style on the oak that they're using to make the wine. And that is amazing for us because, you know, when you build out that family tree of French oak, American oak, different types of grape varietals, different size barrels, you know, it could be 100 liter, 200 liter, or 300 liter barrel. It could be a first fill or one vintage at the winery versus multiple vintages at the wine. There's about 140 different barrels that go into making Starward Twofold and Starward Nova, right? So the projects more recently have been an examination of just an idea. So do we go across and just basically say, well, let's try wineries, you know, wines from this particular winery, wine barrels from this particular winery. Or in the instance of the octaves, let's try wine barrels that make a particular wine at that particular winery. And the Octavius wine from Yalumba winery is like some of the oldest Shiraz vines in the world, right? In a single paddock that are then pressed and fermented and then sort of seasoned and aged in octave barrels. So octave in barrel world basically is a size. It's 100 liters in size. Far smaller than, you know, it's obviously half the size of an American 200 and something, 225 liter barrel, but 1.4 times the surface area per liter of liquid, because you're just basically shrinking the air out of the barrel, not necessarily the oak on the outside. So amazing, you know, expression of like the winemaker and the wood policy that the winemakers used and the spirit engaging with the liquid itself. So octaves for me was a lot of fun for two reasons. Number one, it's probably the most expressive project we've released in terms of flavor profile. Like it's really big Shiraz berry characteristics, but also balanced with the amazing spirit that comes off our stills and the oak that they're kind of sourcing and coopering on site. So that's one aspect of why it's fun, because it's just a really lovely expression from the distillery. But the other reason why is we wouldn't be drinking wine barrel aged whiskey from Starward if it weren't for this family winery called Yalumba offering me their barrels to kind of pilot this project. And we got all of these barrels all at once, enabling me to kind of really learn with one parcel of spirit and one parcel of wine barrels, what happens when you age whiskey in red wine. So it was the ultimate project in its first instance. So it's kind of fitting that it's the first one that we've launched in the United States.
Very cool. I'm definitely looking forward to trying that one. And Shiraz is one of my favorite wine styles, so I'm even more eager to.
Yeah, and look, I think one thing to note, this, you know, a lot of people kind of shy away from wine finished, you know, whether it's port wine or just red wine finished whiskey, and Starward sort of turns up really differently to finishes, because you've got to remember you've had that first hit of a brand new American oak, and then on top of that, another oak kind of hit with that finishing, transferring out of that first barrel into the second barrel. So with Starward, it's just one constant sort of. So the wine characters, and it's for 3 Melbourne years, and so the wine characters have got, I guess, more time to integrate, and they're a little bit more imbalanced than you can find with some of those finishes that can be really the Aussie Shiraz of whiskey, right? Poke you in the eyes and say, "Hey, I'm a finish." That's not what Starward is, and so you don't have to love wine to love Starward, but it's certainly kind of, if you do have those sorts of flavor cues in the back of your mind, you're certainly going to pick them up.
Really very cool to try. I know, and not to name any specific brands. I know, as you're talking about finished whiskeys, there's certainly some exceptional finished whiskeys out there. Where they take the base spirit, they've aged it in one type of cask or another, and then added some interesting additional character with the finish. But there's also certainly a lot of whiskeys that I think this didn't work out quite as we'd anticipated, so let's finish it and try to cover over the blemishes. And I know people who sort of steered away from finished whiskeys because they've had bad experiences with some of that. And there's, as you said, a big difference between let's take something that's aged a handful of years in new American oak and then splash some red wine on it by pouring in a wine barrel for 6 months. Versus aging something its entire time in a wine cask. I think that's a big distinction.
Look, 100%. And look, and when done well, when they're done well, particularly with American whiskies, because it's, I think in Scotland they've been doing that for quite some time, and the whole aging regime is very, very different. Just because barrels are sleeping over there, they're resting, whereas in Melbourne they're kind of working every day as they are here over seasons, right? When done well, like, they are unbelievable, and that they're just delicious. But I think that the trap is, just finding the right source of barrels that work with the spirit, the aged spirit, as it stands at that point in time, can often be, a challenge. And, like I say that from personal experience. When we first started, I just figured, well, if it makes $100 wine, that barrel must be good, right? But then we kind of get it to the distillery and it might not be that generous, or it could be like not even tainted, but just sort of like really not doing anything for the whiskey in terms of the aging process. And so, I totally understand why, if you're just sort of like new at wine cask finishing, that you could kind of find yourself with these things that become like, well, neither a good reflection of the original spirit that was in there, nor what wine finishing can be at the end. So like it's just right sizing and fitting the spirit to the wine, to the barrel that you're kind of sourcing.
I imagine there must be a really interesting challenge too, when you're to find what sort of cask is going to be the right pairing with the spirit you've distilled.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do the kind of philosophy at the distillery is that in the brew house and still house, we recruit brewers. And in the bond store, where we're sort of aging the whiskey, sourcing barrels, aging the whiskey, and then blending, we recruit winemakers. And so that, like, when we're looking at sourcing barrels, it's winemaker to winemaker talk. They talk a different language, right? And so that very quickly we can kind of come to like an understanding of like, look, that sounds amazing, but they're not the barrels for us, because we just know what we're looking for. Or we'll take, you might be emptying 100 barrels, we'll take 50 of them. We don't need that much, because otherwise that balance is going to be out of kilter.
Time for a tough question. You've certainly put out a wide variety of expressions, both in your core range and in the project range. If you had to pick one, do you have a favorite whiskey you've produced?
I mean, the Glibance is the one that's in my hand. That's kind of, they're all amazing. Look, I'll give you the top three because that's
Okay.
kind of fair, right? And I'm not saying that because it's limited release in the United States now, because I think if people are curious about it, they need to kind of hop online and pick one up because they're not going to last long. We don't have many of them here, so I'm not concerned about selling the Octaves, but the Octaves does have a really special place in my heart, and is a wonderful reflection of like that red wine cask aging process. It's at 96 proof, so a little higher than our standard core range. And really, those smaller barrels really drive a lot more flavor and balance into the whiskey than you'll get from a larger barrel, in terms of them being a little bit more spirit forward or more extractive wood focused. So the Octaves is definitely one of them. The one that gets me up every morning, to come to work and gets me the most excited is Twofold. Like, that's our wheated whiskey. It's broadly available. It's available every day of the week. It's the reason why I started Starward, for that sharing cabinet whiskey. It's somewhere between 30 and 35 bucks a bottle. It's double gold medal winning, along with all of, as is the Octaves. And it's just one of those things where, for me, I'm so proud to be elbowing out some space on that sharing cabinet for a distinctly Australian whiskey, something that like people haven't tried before, but I know that if they love whiskies spelt both ways, that they're going to really fall in love with it. So that's exciting for me. Like, it's exciting that we've got, we can wake up every day and do that. And then I think sentimentally, our first release, which is called Starward Solera, this is aged in fortified wine barrels. So still that wine barrel aging process. But the magic of Solera is, and this is, again, talk about shamelessly stealing, is straight out of the Glenfiddich 15-year-olds playbook, which is we've vatted each of the releases. So basically, when I launched Solera in 2013, it's quite a while ago now, it's crazy to think, but we filled a 1,500-gallon vat, and that vat has never been emptied. So basically, each batch of Solera is about 300 gallons, and we disgorge that from the vat and bottle it, and then top that 300 gallons back up with aged whiskey, and such that, look, that's been running now for 11 years. It'll be 11 years. And so the ability to be able to have stock that's 11 years old in a release coming to market month to month, quarter to quarter, is pretty exciting for a craft distillery, and particularly one that I can put my hand on my heart on and say, in that bottle is the very first barrel of Starward we ever emptied.
That's very cool.
So, that comes to the United States on limited allocation. I have to kind of sumo wrestle the production team to kind of get some to the States, because it's so highly prized. But, if I can't pull the founder card out sometimes, then I'm kind of missing a trick. So that's, we're quite fortunate in America to have the founder live here. So we've got a lovely supply of that, and it's just landed. So again, if you go to our website, you'll find stockists locally that may not even know that it's come back into stock, but you can also get it online and shipped to you as well.
That's very exciting for me. Hopefully, when I post this and other people can see it, maybe it'll still be available and they can hopefully grab some. That sounds really cool. So we've heard your favorites. I want to ask about a couple of recommendations now. Out of the whiskeys that were the big award winners this year, what do you recommend if you had to pick one for like the serious whiskey geek who wants to try something new?
I think it really depends on, they're going to be really well rewarded with all of our releases, and I think it's their jumping off point. Because serious whiskey drink is still a really broad category, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, for example, Twofold being 60% wheat, 40% malted barley weeded whiskey is very unique. Putting the wine cask aging to one side, right? So that's kind of a curiosity in and of itself, you know. And there's been some Japanese whiskeys that have kind of taken grain and malt for a walk. And so, you know, like if that's your kind of bet, then you're going to be really well rewarded with twofold and like get change out of $50. So that's kind of one end of the continuum. Nova as a single malt really is amazing because it is all of that red wine cask aging that you see in twofold. But the single malt production process, if you're kind of into your American single malts, is again, you know, that modern twist on that tradition. And so you can then sort of like say, well, let me compare and contrast that to what's going on at Balcones in Texas, or Westland here in Seattle, or Westward in Portland, or, you know, all of the, you know, plethora of single malt distilleries that are out and about, right? So you can kind of take that for a walk and say, okay, I want to compare and contrast that with a red wine barrel aged tint to it. And then, you know, like we've got these limited releases and single barrels, which are really like, now we're getting into uber provenance of like our single barrel, which might be French oak, wet filled, single vintage at the winery, come to Starward, and, you know, available for you to enjoy like as a single barrel of that. Comparing that to the, you know, because that's basically 1 ounce of what you'll find in Nova, right? The other ounces are all different types of barrels, you know, or it could be something completely wacky like a second fill PX barrel into wheat spirit that's 7 years of age. That's another single barrel that we've done, right? So, you know, because of those single barrels, honestly, we could kind of release a single barrel every week of the year, Josh, and still not come back to the same single barrel. In fact, it'll probably take us 2 years, to be honest, to come back to the same single barrel. Such is the diversity in the bond store. So it's a lot of fun. And again, you know, the listeners or viewers of this can basically go to our website, and we've got a list of where all of our single barrels are located, and I'd highly encourage them to go there. And they can hook, you know, hit me up on Instagram or Twitter and sort of like ask me, tell me a little bit more about this particular barrel and why it's so different to this number, and I'm be more than happy to kind of help them navigate the world of these single barrels.
Awesome, and I'll post your website and your information in the video notes so that they can ask you some questions.
Wonderful.
And I know we're sort of coming up on time, but I did want to ask just a couple other questions. I know that Starward also recently partnered with the Michelin Guide, and I'd love to hear more about what that partnership entails and what it means for people like me who are both whiskey fans and serious foodies.
Josh, you're not alone, right? That's the point. And it comes back to where we were starting in the first point of like, you know, the dad whiskey drinker of like 20 years ago is not who's drinking whiskey today. And, you know, they're quite, you know, we found them to really love flavor, period, whether it's in a spirit form or in food form, whether it's in their hot sauce or like what's on their plate. And so, you know, I'm kind of, you know, a food lover myself. So, you know, for me, it was just an opportunity to basically, I guess, partner with, you know, the most credentialed restaurants in the United States and sort of explore flavor from a different perspective, right? And take some of what happens with cuisine on the plate into the glass, which is what mixology is at the end of the day. And so that was really exciting. 8 out of 10 Michelin restaurants now serve Starward, which is pretty, it's actually 8.7. But, you know, it's pretty exciting for me to kind of say that, you know, being the official partner of Michelin, which was an optional thing for them, you know, like to kind of then the restaurants to opt in, and, you know, they, you know, resoundingly kind of said, yes, this is a whiskey we want on our back bar or in a cocktail. So that's been really exciting. It's the only to start, like as much as we're doing the 1, 2, 3 stars, we want to do bib gourmands, and we want to do the local taco truck, you know, and sort of talk about how you can kind of pair whiskey with tacos. You know, I mean, Twofold Taco Tuesdays has a ring to it, I think. So, like,
That
let's talk about how we can bring that to life.
does sound good. I have to say, I am yet to try a glass of whiskey while I'm having, say, Mexican food, but I don't have a good reason why I haven't. I'm gonna probably give that a try this weekend.
And if you think about it, like, people don't have a problem with tequila, but it's typically mixed, right? So why not a whiskey, which is, I might be a little bit biased, but, I think we can throw some shade on the whole tequila category and say whiskey tastes better than tequila anyway. So, like, I mean, if you love a tequila cocktail, you're going to love a whiskey cocktail made with twofold in a tequila cocktail.
I'm gonna have to try that.
Like,
Sounds
just swap out the Paloma. I mean, just swap out the tequila and put twofold in. I'm telling you now, you'll have a good time.
that sounds delicious. Um, while we're on it, then let's talk cocktails for another moment. Do you have a favorite cocktail with your whiskeys?
Yeah, it depends on my mood, right? Like, as most cocktails do. But look, if a whiskey aged in red wine barrels can't make a decent Manhattan, then I think we should shut the gates, right? I mean, so that's probably my go-to in terms of just showcasing the versatility of the whiskey, because traditionally whiskeys, Manhattans are with rye, and if you compare twofold or Nova to a rye, they're very different drinks. But I actually feel like Nova particularly is a really good foil for a rye, because it's sort of accentuating some of those spicy characteristics that are coming out of the oak, as opposed to what the rye spice is providing, right? So that's a really great example. I mean, long drinks, are always fun, and coming into this time of the year, we do twofold with freshly squeezed apple juice. So lots of ice, an ounce and a half of twofold, and then top it up with some, like you would a mixer with cloudy apple juice. That's delicious. Green tea is another one if you kind of explore it, experimental, and want to take it for a walk. I found in America we've got to sweeten it up a bit with a bit of maple or agave syrup, but twofold with green tea is delicious, as is Nova. So you can take all of these whiskeys for a walk in lots of different ways, the classics, but also modern ones as well.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to playing around with some cocktails. And okay, one last question. I know most of the people who are probably watching this or read my blog are probably people who are already whiskey geeks, because who else spends a lot of time watching videos and reading about whiskey. But there's also, I know, people who stumble on this, just looking up something new, who might be brand new to the world of whiskey or just getting their feet wet. Do you have any tips or recommendations for someone who's just breaking into this, thinks, I kind of like whiskey, but what do I do now?
Yeah, I think so. There's two things. Here's my general philosophy, because I think we all started there, Josh. I think it's not like someone's kind of born with a whiskey gene that makes them sort of some aficionado, right? So we all started there, and that's might be helpful for some of the more geeky members of our community to remember that sometimes. But I think that there's two parts to it in my mind. The first is there's a very, very big difference between tasting whiskey and drinking whiskey. And I know from personal experience, and we actually did something really fun at the launch party for the Octaves, which was, what does music taste like? And we drank, Octaves music, kind of thought there was a lovely kind of connection there. And but we basically went into a studio, like an acoustically kind of tuned studio with $1 million speakers and sound systems, and then drank our whiskeys, the same whiskey from the same glass with different songs. And, we should always have a healthy dose of skepticism. And I was one of those people, and I was blown away at how different the whiskey tasted with different songs. So just imagine what your mood, your health, like just in terms of like a coming down with a cold, the environment you're in. Are you in the kitchen? Are you in the lounge? Are you at a nightclub? Are you at a bar? What did I have for dinner? Thai or Indian or Italian? makes a huge difference on what you're tasting. So I always highly recommend that if you're tasting whiskey, try and keep it as consistent as possible, and give the drink the benefit of the doubt. It's probably you. 4 times out of 10, when we do sensory work, people elect to not continue because we always have a reference that we come back to. That's like, well, if this isn't tasting the same, why am I going to taste 5 new expressions that I've never tasted before? So drinking and tasting are very different things. Drink anytime, any place, any way you like. But if you're judging a whiskey on its merits, try and do it as consistent as possible. So that's number one kind of idea. And number two is don't be afraid. It's so funny when you do have people that are kind of new to whiskey at masterclasses, and they'll peep up and go, "Is that like vanilla?" And I was like, "Yes, of course it is." And like, so I think don't be afraid to kind of share what you're sensing and vocalize it, because that's the only way you're going to improve. Actually, it's almost like that learning thing. You need to say the words out loud for it to kind of mean something, so that you'll remember next time you smell it or taste it, or feel it, that's something that you can recall. So don't be shy. Don't be shy about your tasting notes and things like that. And because I think that people can be overwhelmed and intimidated. But whiskey today is not the same. It might be in liquid form in some places the same drink we were drinking 20 years ago, but the whole rarefied occasion and pompously that surrounded it in the past is all gone. And I think that for the most part, the community today is welcoming of new people to come on board, and new, like, I love the trend at the distillery. We kind of track this in terms of our masterclass attendees, is almost a 50-50 gender split. And I'm telling you now, the 50% females are not plus ones. You know what I mean? Like, they're there on their own accord, just kind of really curious about learning more about whiskey, and that's really exciting. So that, take comfort and confidence in that you're not alone, and that that your palate is the best judge you've got.
I think great advice. Something that I've heard that really resonates with what you're saying. Something I've heard taken to heart is that when you're tasting whiskey, whatever you're smelling and tasting is correct.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's don't second guess yourself. Enjoy what you experience in it. And I think, like you said, that pompously that sort of used to be so prevalent seems to have faded. And enjoy what you like. If you taste something and you get certain tasting notes out of it, recognize that you're not just an inexperienced palate who is not getting what other people are getting. Enjoy the flavors and aromas you get from it.
Exactly. And look, to be fair too, like, the most revered and like highly respected whiskey journalists and judges in the world are always learning and open-minded and surprised, right? So if they're comfortable to kind of live in that world of being a little bit vulnerable, of like, I don't know what's coming up next. I mean, even though they've seen thousands and tens of thousands of different expressions, then you should be too, right? Like, it's a take comfort in that, and enjoy whiskey. And I think the only other thing I'd add is that be open-minded about the way you drink whiskey too. Like, to put, from a tasting perspective, when we're at the distillery, we cut it down to 20%. And the reason we do that is, like, we all know what booze tastes like. I'm looking to find what else is going on in that particular barrel or parcel of whiskey, or those sorts of things. Of course, before we bottle it, it's always at the proof we want to, like, we give it a seal of approval. But that tasting process can be done at a lower proof point, just so that you get to a point at which you're comfortable with the flavors and less the alcohol. The alcohol's for enjoyment, right? But sensorially, just add a little bit of water, and find the bit that you kind of go, okay, now I'm dialed into the flavors and not so much the alcohol.
David, thank you so much for your time today. Again, congratulations on all the big wins. I'm definitely looking forward to trying out some of the new expressions, and I'm going to be posting a new video on some of those in the near future as well. But again, thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too, Josh, and thanks so much for your support.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's catch up in person at some point. It'd be great.
I would love that.
All right, take care.
Take care.